A Russian journalist has been killed in East Ukraine. Igor Kornelyuk was a correspondent for Rуского TV channel. He and his crew were filming outside the city of Lugansk when an army shell landed just beside them and exploded. The sound engineer, Anton Voloshin, is reported to be in critical condition. The cameraman managed to survive, and this is video which he shot minutes after the deadly incident. Well, you can see an explosion there. And a khaki man in a uniform, that's a rebel fighter who, along with his fellow fighters, was trying to get a group of refugees out of the war zone while the Russian TV crew was filming. Well, in the now, we want to send our deep condolences to Igor's wife and 7-year-old daughter and hope that his colleague Anton recovers. It's clear that being a journalist doesn't mean you're protected, as Ukraine's military is stepping up its assaults, and in some cases, it even makes you a deliberate target.
We were stopped at a National Guard checkpoint and asked to get out of the car and show our IDs. When they saw our Russian passports and found out that we were members of the Zvezda TV channel, they changed their faces. They started joking that they'd caught a goldfish or won the jackpot. They forced us into a car and we were taken away. Our eyes were covered and eventually we were pushed into some basement at gunpoint. Different armed people were coming to us, threatening us. They promised to shoot us and bury us in the field. They said they hated Russia and will do everything not to let us go alive. Then we were dragged out of the cellar and forced into a car. We were beaten by rifle butts.
Well, that's how another Russian TV crew was treated by the Ukrainian military. The journalists were released, but Yevgeny Davidov, who you just heard from, he was hospitalized today, suffering from hearing loss after being beaten while in custody. Joining me live tonight in the Now is journalist Brian McDonald. He's been following the situation in Ukraine. Brian, I'm here in Russia. This journalist's death, Igor's death, is news #1. It's the top headline. What are you hearing about the incident outside of Russia?
Nothing. Absolutely zilch. Much like in other situations recently, such as the bombing in Lugansk. I just watched the main evening news on BBC. There wasn't anything about it.
All right. Obviously, Twitter is a different world. I think it's fair to say. Some foreign journalists, they're tweeting about it. Although I have to say that they're stressing that Igor was a Russian state journalist. What difference does it make? If a BBC
journalist was killed in Ukraine, would they call him a British state journalist? I don't think so. I mean, BBC is 100% owned by the British government, just as Igor's channel is owned by the Russian government. I don't see any particular difference. One thing about Twitter, by the way, it's very well and good for journalists to message each other on Twitter and to put sympathy on Twitter, but Twitter is not widely read by the general public, and Twitter really is sort of, it's like the old Fleet Street drinking houses of the 1970s and 80s. It's kind of like a sober version of it, where the journalists come together to write messages to each other, but I'm not sure the general public sees very much of it. I mean, there's 70 million people in the UK, there's 7 million people on the island of Ireland. I don't know how many of them follow Russian journalists on Twitter, or I mean Russian correspondents on Twitter, you know?
I think it's fair to say that if this was a Western journalist that was somehow harmed by the pro-Russian, they're called, fighters, that this would be a different case. We would be hearing about it, as we heard about Simon Ostrovsky's detention there.
Simon Ostrovsky was kidnapped or detained, or whatever you want to call it, by the separatists, if you want to call them that, or rebels, as some people call them, in East Ukraine. It was on the news, yeah. I mean, it was lead items on. He was interviewed. When he got back to the United States, he was basically kind of like Charles Lindbergh coming back from his famous flight. He was on daytime television, breakfast television, evening television, chat shows, comedy shows. I mean, you swear the guy had achieved something, you know? When he was detained by the Ukrainian government, albeit for a shorter time, it was barely mentioned. I just noticed tonight, by the way, that Oksana Romaniuk, who's the Ukrainian representative for Reporters Sans Frontières, which is a Paris-based organization that looks out for the rights of journalists to operate freely, has defended the killing of Igor tonight, saying that he wasn't identifying himself clearly. I mean, I find that outrageous. I can't believe it, to be honest with you. It's completely mad.
I should mention that our producers, Brian, were in touch with Reporters Without Borders. She, of course, calls herself a representative. They didn't quite confirm that she officially works for them, but they were, needless to say, surprised by her by her tweet. They didn't know about it. We informed them of it. They said that this most likely isn't the official position of Reporters Without Borders. But why are we seeing so little reaction from organizations like Human Rights Watch, like the OSCE?
I mean, Human Rights Watch are constantly, through the representative in London, who has some kind of connections to Ukraine. I think maybe his girlfriend or his wife is from there. He's tweeted about it. He's constantly mentioning atrocities, and they are atrocities, let us be clear, carried out by the rebel side, but he seems to conveniently have no knowledge or doesn't know anything about atrocities committed by the Ukrainian state forces, which are of equal import, if not even worse, you know, in some cases. I mean, the problem with the media here is that the media guys are basically hanging out in Kyiv. They're not going to Lugansk, they're not going to Donetsk, and they're kind of living in a bubble. Many of them don't speak Russian. Many of them don't even understand 10 sentences in Russian. So they're just being fed everything by Euromaidan PR. And what you find as well is that international news organizations like Storyful, for example, here in Ireland, which is based in Dublin, AP, different ones, are using journalists in Ukraine without knowing if they're really journalists or they're actually PR mouthpieces. Like if you take Miroslava Petsa, who worked for Petro Poroshenko on Channel 5 until a few months ago, she's not an independent journalist. James Miller and Michael Weiss of the Interpreter magazine based in America, they're funded by Pavel Hodorkovsky, whose father, as we all know, stole billions of dollars from the Russian taxpayer. These are not neutral people, but they're being presented by foreign media as neutral people, you know?
It's very dangerous, I agree. Brian McDonald with us in the Now tonight. Thanks so much for your analysis.
Nice to talk to you again. Bye-bye.